Get him off that plane before he destroys this airline. The command ripped across Gate C-27 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport with the force of a thunderclap, turning hundreds of waiting faces toward the cockpit of Flight 728. Captain Marcus Bennett stood perfectly still inside the open flight deck doorway, one hand gripping the emergency checklist, while the other pointed toward the glowing engine display that refused to stop flashing amber. His calm brown eyes never left the instruments, even as two airport security officers hurried toward him. The faint smell of heated fuel drifted through the conditioned air, subtle enough that almost no one else seemed to notice, but Marcus had spent more than 8,000 flight hours learning that disasters rarely announce themselves with explosions. They whispered first. They waited for someone to ignore them. Beyond the cockpit windows, the afternoon sun reflected across the silver fuselage, and baggage crews continued loading the final containers as if nothing at all were wrong. Families settled into their seats. Business travelers answered emails. Children pressed their faces against the oval windows, hoping to watch another smooth departure from the busiest airport in America. Everything looked ordinary. Everything sounded ordinary. That was exactly what terrified Marcus. 3 minutes earlier, while completing one final scan of the engine monitoring system, he had noticed a temperature spike inside the left side fuel manifold that should have been impossible during ground operations. Seconds later came the pressure fluctuation, then the warning light, then the unmistakable scent that every experienced pilot respected without question. "We need to evacuate now," Marcus had said into the headset, his voice controlled but firm. First Officer Emily Carter looked from the panel to Marcus, then back again. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Marcus nodded once. "I don't guess when lives are involved." Emily reached for the radio, but before she could speak, the operations frequency crackled. "Captain Bennett," an executive voice interrupted sharply. "Hold your position." Marcus recognized it immediately. Richard Collins, Executive Vice President of Flight Operations, was watching through the Airport Operations Center. "Sir," Marcus answered, "I have indications of a possible fuel system fire developing. I am requesting immediate evacuation." A long silence followed, broken only by the steady hum of conditioned air flowing through the cabin. Then Richard laughed. Not loudly, but just enough for everyone on the frequency to hear. "You want to evacuate 214 passengers because of one warning light?" Marcus never raised his voice. "Because the warning light is supported by temperature, pressure, and odor. The checklist requires immediate action." Another voice joined the call, Linda Parker from Corporate Operations. "Maintenance signed off on that aircraft 45 minutes ago. You're delaying an on-time departure." Marcus looked again at the display. The temperature climbed another 2 degrees. "With respect, ma'am, I don't care about departure times. I care about whether everyone walks away today." Outside the cockpit, several flight attendants exchanged worried glances. One quietly asked another, "What's happening?" Neither had an answer. In the boarding area beyond the jet bridge windows, passengers waiting for neighboring flights began noticing the growing tension. Phones slowly lifted into the air. A teenager whispered, "Someone's recording." Marcus pressed the interphone button. "Cabin crew, prepare for a possible evacuation." Before another instruction could leave his mouth, Richard's voice exploded through the headset. "Negative. Stand down immediately." Marcus closed his eyes for one brief second. He remembered his father in Detroit telling him years ago, "A real pilot isn't paid to be popular. He's paid to make the hard call before everyone else understands why." Marcus opened his eyes again. "I cannot stand down," he replied quietly, "not with these indications." The operations channel went silent. 10 endless seconds passed. Then Richard spoke again, colder than before. "Captain Marcus Bennett, effective immediately, you are relieved of command. Security is on the way. Exit the cockpit." Emily turned toward Marcus in disbelief. "Richard, you can't be serious." "This conversation is over," Richard answered. "Remove him from the aircraft." Marcus looked once more at the instrument panel. The warning light was no longer blinking. It was glowing steadily. Marcus slowly lowered the emergency checklist onto the center console, without taking his eyes off the glowing engine display. The cockpit suddenly felt smaller than it had only minutes before. The steady hum of avionics mixing with the muffled voices gathering outside the open flight deck door. First Officer Emily Carter looked at him with disbelief. "Captain, tell me you are not actually leaving." Marcus answered quietly. "I am leaving because they can remove me from this seat. They cannot remove what these instruments are telling us." The warning indicator remained steady, no longer flashing as though the aircraft itself had given up trying to convince anyone that something was wrong. Outside the cockpit, Richard Collins appeared at the front of the boarding bridge, wearing a dark tailored suit instead of a flight uniform, followed closely by Linda Parker and two airport security officers. Passengers craned their necks from several rows back, sensing that something far beyond an ordinary delay was unfolding. Richard folded his arms with practiced confidence. "Captain Bennett, your judgment has been compromised. This aircraft has already been inspected. Maintenance has cleared it. We are not disrupting 214 passengers because you think you smell something." Marcus stepped into the aisle, careful to keep his voice measured. "I do not think. I verified abnormal fuel temperature, abnormal pressure, and the odor of heated fuel. Those are 3 independent indicators." Richard smiled without warmth. "And maintenance gave us 3 independent signatures saying this airplane is safe." Emily spoke before she could stop herself. "Sir, I saw the indications too." Richard turned toward her. "Did you personally diagnose a fire?" Emily hesitated. "No." "Then this conversation is finished." The silence inside the forward cabin became almost unbearable. A flight attendant named Sarah Lopez stood frozen beside the forward galley, clutching a stack of passenger manifests against her chest. She had worked with Marcus several times before and knew he never raised concerns without reason. She quietly asked, "Captain, are we really in danger?" Marcus looked at her for a brief moment before answering. "I hope I am wrong. I truly hope I am wrong." Richard stepped forward. "Enough." One of the security officers approached Marcus with visible discomfort. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Marcus gave a small nod. "I understand. I will cooperate." As he removed his headset and carefully placed it onto the captain's seat, several passengers standing near the front of the cabin began whispering among themselves. A middle-aged businessman shook his head. Probably another pilot who cannot handle the pressure. A woman holding the hand of her young son frowned. He does not look frightened. He looks worried. Her son, no older than 8, stared directly at Marcus. "Mom, why would the pilot leave if the airplane is okay?" She had no answer. Marcus paused beside the cockpit door and turned back toward Emily. "Do not stop watching Engine 2. If that temperature rises even a little more, do not wait for permission." Emily swallowed hard. "I promise." Richard interrupted immediately. "She will follow company procedures." Marcus met Richard's eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. "Company procedures do not change the laws of physics." Richard's expression hardened. "You have spent your entire career believing you are the smartest person in every room." Marcus shook his head gently. "No, sir. I have spent my career believing every warning deserves to be respected." The security officers escorted him down the jet bridge, while dozens of smartphones quietly recorded every step. Some passengers assumed they were witnessing an argument over schedules. Others believed it was a disciplinary issue. Almost no one imagined the pilot being removed was still trying to protect them. As Marcus reached the terminal, he stopped and looked through the large glass windows toward the aircraft, resting peacefully beneath the warm Georgia afternoon sun. Baggage loading had finished. The fuel truck had already pulled away. Ground crews disconnected the final service cables. Everything looked routine. Everything looked safe. Yet somewhere deep beneath polished aluminum and painted panels, a temperature continued climbing 1 degree at a time, completely indifferent to executive titles, public relations, departure statistics, or human pride. Marcus remained motionless beside the terminal windows as the aircraft sat quietly at Gate C-27, almost beautiful beneath the late afternoon sunlight, while inside the airport operations center several floors above the concourse, an entirely different conversation unfolded. Richard Collins tossed Marcus Bennett's written safety report onto the polished conference table with obvious frustration. "We are already 23 minutes behind schedule," he said. "Every additional minute costs this airline money, damages customer confidence, and creates delays across the East Coast." Linda Parker folded her hands carefully. "Social media is already circulating videos of the captain being escorted off the aircraft. If we cancel this flight now, every national news outlet will have the story before dinner. Greg Foster, the chief operations manager, looked at the maintenance clearance displayed on the large wall monitor. Inspection Team 3 signed every item. Fuel lines passed visual inspection. Engine compartment showed no external abnormalities. We have documentation supporting the release. Richard nodded immediately. Exactly. We have evidence. He has instincts. A younger maintenance engineer named Daniel Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Captain Bennett does have one of the strongest safety records in the company, Richard answered without looking at him. Safety records do not make anyone infallible. Daniel hesitated before continuing. No, sir, but he has never requested an emergency evacuation without cause. Linda glanced toward the digital departure board. Can another captain take the aircraft? Greg replied. Captain William Harper is already in the terminal, former Navy pilot. He can be here within 5 minutes. Richard smiled for the first time all afternoon. Good. Replace Bennett immediately. Down on the concourse, Captain William Harper walked briskly toward the gate carrying his flight bag, clearly confused by the unexpected assignment. The first person he saw was Marcus standing alone, near the wide glass windows overlooking the aircraft. William slowed his pace. Marcus, what happened? Marcus looked toward the airplane instead of answering immediately. Engine 2 is telling us something. William frowned. Maintenance says everything checks out. Marcus nodded slowly. Maintenance looked with their eyes. I listened with experience. William studied his friend's face. There was no panic, no anger, only quiet conviction. Would you put your family on that airplane? Marcus finally asked. The question lingered between them. William did not answer right away. I do not know, he admitted honestly. Marcus replied, I do. I would not. Before William could respond, Richard Collins emerged from the jet bridge entrance with Linda close behind him. Captain Harper, Richard called confidently. Thank you for stepping in. William turned toward the executives. Sir, I would like to review Captain Bennett's findings before accepting the aircraft. Richard's expression tightened. There is nothing to review. The aircraft is airworthy. William remained respectful. Even so, I would prefer to examine the engine data myself. Linda stepped forward. That is unnecessary. We need leadership, not hesitation. Marcus quietly picked up his flight bag from the floor. William, the final decision is yours. Richard immediately interrupted. Actually, it is ours. The words echoed through the terminal more loudly than Richard intended, drawing curious glances from nearby passengers. A gray-haired woman waiting to board another flight leaned toward her husband and whispered, That young pilot looks like he is trying to warn them. Her husband watched Marcus for several seconds before answering softly. Sometimes the hardest person to hear is the one refusing to raise his voice. William looked through the terminal windows toward the aircraft, where sunlight reflected across the left wing with almost blinding brightness. Ramp agents removed the final wheel chocks. The pushback tug slowly rolled into position. Everything appeared calm, efficient, and completely under control. Yet Marcus noticed something almost no one else did. A faint, shimmering distortion rose above the left engine nacelle, subtle enough to disappear each time the breeze shifted. He closed his eyes for one brief moment and whispered so quietly that only he could hear the words. Please do not let it be too late. Captain William Harper remained at the edge of the jet bridge entrance, his flight bag still hanging from one shoulder as he watched the ground crew prepare the aircraft for pushback. He had accepted difficult assignments throughout his career, but none had ever begun with another captain quietly warning him to keep everyone off the airplane. Richard Collins checked his watch and spoke with growing impatience. Captain Harper, every minute we stand here creates another delay across the network. I need you in that cockpit now. William did not move. Before I take command, I want the engine trend data and the maintenance log from the last 48 hours. Richard forced a thin smile. You have already been told the aircraft is safe. William answered calmly. Then the records will confirm it. Linda Parker stepped closer, lowering her voice. William, this company depends on leaders who make decisions instead of feeding unnecessary fear. We cannot have two captains questioning certified maintenance within the same hour. Marcus Bennett remained several yards away, saying nothing. He understood the pressure William was facing because only minutes earlier, He had stood in exactly the same place. A ramp supervisor hurried toward the group carrying a tablet. Pushback crew is asking for confirmation. They are ready whenever the cockpit gives clearance. Richard immediately replied, "They will have it shortly." William looked toward Marcus one more time. "If you were still in command, what would you do right now?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "I would evacuate every passenger before the first wheel moved an inch." The words hung in the warm Georgia air. Richard let out a frustrated breath. "Enough. This conversation is over." He turned toward the security officers still standing nearby. "Escort Captain Bennett away from the operational area. I do not want him interfering with this departure." Marcus offered no resistance. As he stepped back into the terminal, he noticed Sarah Lopez standing near the aircraft door. Their eyes met only briefly. She could see the quiet certainty on his face, and it unsettled her far more than shouting ever could have. She entered the forward galley and leaned toward Emily Carter. "Is he really wrong?" Emily stared at the engine display, where the temperature reading had climbed another fraction, despite the engines not yet producing takeoff power. "I wish I could say yes," she whispered. William finally climbed into the left seat, but instead of preparing for pushback, he immediately scanned every engine parameter on the primary display. Nothing appeared dramatic. Nothing demanded immediate action. Yet one value refused to match the others. Engine 2 continued running slightly warmer than expected. Not enough to trigger another alert, but enough to disturb an experienced pilot. He opened the electronic maintenance log and frowned. "Emily, has this airplane had recent work on the left fuel system?" Emily nodded. "A valve assembly was replaced yesterday evening." William looked back at the numbers. "Was an operational run completed afterward?" Emily searched the digital records. "Only a ground idle test." Before William could continue, Richard's voice filled the headset once again. "Captain Harper, report your status." William answered honestly, "I am reviewing maintenance history." Richard's patience finally disappeared. "You are reviewing paperwork because Captain Bennett planted doubt where none existed. Complete the checklist and depart." William looked through the windshield toward the terminal windows. Marcus was still standing there, barely visible behind the glass, watching the aircraft without moving. William remembered hearing stories about Marcus years before they had ever flown together. Senior instructors often described him with the same sentence: "He is the pilot who notices what everyone else misses." That reputation had never come from dramatic rescues or headlines. It came from thousands of careful decisions that prevented headlines from ever existing. William slowly removed his hand from the pushback checklist and pressed the interphone instead. "Ground crew, hold position." "Do not disconnect the tug yet," the reply came instantly. "Holding position, Captain." Richard's voice returned almost immediately, sharper than before. "On what authority are you delaying this departure?" William took one slow breath before answering. "On the authority of the captain responsible for every soul on this airplane, and I am not satisfied with what I am seeing yet." Silence filled the radio frequency, but outside the cockpit, the steady glow on the Engine 2 display remained unchanged, waiting with the quiet patience of a problem that had still not revealed its full truth. The silence that followed William Harper's refusal seemed to spread through the cockpit and into every corner of the aircraft. Outside, the pushback tug remained connected, its operator waiting patiently for instructions that never came. Passengers glanced at their watches, wondering why the airplane had stopped moving. Flight attendants walked the aisle with practiced smiles, offering calm explanations about a brief operational delay. But even they could sense that something had changed. Emily Carter continued watching the engine display, and her heartbeat quickened when the temperature increased by another single degree. It was a tiny change, almost insignificant by itself, yet she remembered Marcus saying that disasters whispered before they shouted. William leaned closer to the screen, comparing every reading against the maintenance records. "This trend should not exist," he murmured. Before Emily could answer, Richard Collins appeared again at the cockpit door, having walked down the jet bridge with visible determination. His expression was no longer merely frustrated. It reflected a man convinced that his authority was being challenged in front of employees, passengers, and cameras. "Captain Harper," he said firmly, "step out of the cockpit for a moment." William remained seated. I am in the middle of evaluating a possible safety issue. Richard folded his arms. No, you are delaying a fully inspected aircraft because another pilot allowed emotion to cloud his judgment, and now he has influenced yours. William slowly removed his headset and stood. I am not acting on emotion. I am acting on data. Richard pointed toward the open cockpit door. Outside. Now. Emily watched the exchange without speaking. Sarah Lopez stood just beyond the galley curtain, her face growing increasingly tense as nearby passengers quietly observed every movement. A businessman in the first row sighed loudly. This airline cannot even decide who is flying the plane. Across the aisle, the mother with the young son gently squeezed his hand. The boy looked toward the cockpit and whispered, Mom, why do the pilots keep looking at the same screen? She answered honestly. Because something must matter more than leaving on time. In the jet bridge, Richard lowered his voice. William, you have two choices. Return to that cockpit, complete the checklist, and depart, or I will relieve you of command, just as I relieved Bennett. William stared at him in disbelief. You would remove 2 captains within 30 minutes instead of investigating one abnormal indication? Richard answered without hesitation. I will protect this airline from unnecessary panic. William shook his head slowly. Aviation has never been made safer by ignoring uncomfortable questions. Richard stepped closer. The board of directors expects this aircraft in the air. The passengers expect this aircraft in the air. The schedule demands this aircraft in the air. William replied quietly. Physics does not care what the schedule demands. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Then a voice crackled across Richard's handheld radio. Operations, this is ramp 4. We have noticed unusual heat near the left engine cowling. Requesting confirmation before pushback. Richard's eyes narrowed. Repeat that. The ramp supervisor answered, We observed what appears to be heat distortion. It could be normal reflection, but we wanted to report it. Richard covered the radio microphone with his hand and looked directly at William. See? Even they are uncertain. William answered immediately. They reported it because they saw something unusual. That is exactly what professionals are supposed to do. Richard uncovered the microphone. Ramp 4. Continue preparing for departure. We will advise. William could not believe what he had just heard. He turned and walked back into the cockpit without waiting for permission. Emily looked up instantly. Captain? William sat down and pressed the interphone to the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We appreciate your patience while we complete an additional systems review. Your safety remains our highest priority. Before he could continue, the steady amber indication suddenly changed. A new caution message appeared beneath the engine temperature display, accompanied by a soft warning tone that neither William nor Emily had seen during the previous inspection. Both pilots froze for a fraction of a second. Emily whispered, almost afraid to say the words aloud. Marcus was right. William Harper and Emily Carter stared at the new caution message without speaking, as though even a single unnecessary word might distract them from understanding what the airplane was trying to say. The cockpit suddenly felt impossibly quiet. The normal sounds of ventilation fans, electrical systems, and distant passenger conversations faded into the background, while the amber message remained steady on the display. It was no longer an isolated temperature trend. The aircraft had begun confirming the pattern that Marcus Bennett had recognized long before anyone else believed him. William slowly reached for the checklist. Emily, verify every fuel indication again. She nodded immediately and compared each value one by one. None of the readings alone appeared catastrophic, yet together they painted a picture that every experienced pilot respected. A slight pressure imbalance, an abnormal temperature increase, a developing system caution. 3 separate clues, now moving in the same direction. Outside the cockpit windows, sunlight reflected across the concrete ramp, where baggage carts stood motionless and ground crews waited for instructions that never seemed to arrive. Richard Collins remained just outside the flight deck, watching impatiently. What now? He demanded. William looked directly at him. The aircraft has generated another caution. Richard stepped closer. A caution is not an emergency. William answered calmly. No, it is an opportunity to prevent one. Richard opened his mouth to argue, But before another sentence could leave him, a maintenance technician wearing a reflective vest hurried up the jet bridge carrying a handheld thermal scanner. Daniel Brooks had ignored the pressure to stay in the operations center. He had trusted his instincts enough to see the airplane himself. Breathing heavily from the quick walk, he looked toward Richard first. "Sir, I requested permission to perform one additional external thermal scan." Richard frowned. Permission denied. Daniel hesitated only briefly before saying, "I already performed it from the ramp." Every eye turned toward him. Daniel looked at William instead of Richard. "The left engine area is reading significantly hotter than expected for a parked aircraft." The words settled heavily inside the cockpit. Emily quietly closed her eyes for a moment. William asked, "Can you verify the measurement?" Daniel nodded. "I checked it twice using 2 different reference points." Richard immediately crossed his arms. "Thermal readings can be influenced by sunlight," Daniel answered respectfully. "Yes, sir. That is why I compared both engines under identical conditions." Silence followed again. Far inside the terminal, Marcus Bennett remained standing beside the tall windows overlooking the gate. Travelers continued walking around him, pulling rolling suitcases and searching departure boards, completely unaware that a decision made within the next few moments might define hundreds of lives. Marcus never took his eyes off the airplane. He noticed airport firefighters casually repositioning a vehicle closer to the taxi lane, responding only to a routine request for readiness. They did not appear alarmed. They were simply following procedure. Marcus appreciated that. Good professionals respected small warnings before they became large ones. Sarah Lopez quietly stepped away from the forward galley and approached the cockpit entrance. "Captain Harper," she asked softly, "should we prepare the cabin?" William looked toward the rows of passengers. Some were reading books. Others were laughing with family members. A little boy had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder. Nobody inside that cabin understood the weight of the conversation taking place only a few feet away. William took one slow breath before answering. "Not yet. I do not want unnecessary fear, but keep every crew member ready." Sarah nodded once without asking another question. Richard finally broke the silence. "You are all creating panic over assumptions." William looked down at the glowing caution message one final time before lifting his eyes again. His voice remained steady, almost gentle. "No, Richard. Panic ignores evidence. Professionalism listens to it." Outside, a light breeze moved across the ramp, carrying away the faint smell that Marcus had noticed nearly half an hour earlier. For one brief moment, the airport looked peaceful again, wrapped in golden afternoon light, as if inviting everyone to believe the danger had passed. Yet inside the cockpit, the instruments continued speaking with quiet honesty, one careful indication at a time, waiting for someone with the authority and humility to finally listen. William Harper did not hesitate another second. He pressed the radio transmitter with a steady hand and spoke with the calm authority that every pilot hoped would never be tested. "Ground, this is Flight 728. Cancel pushback immediately. We are declaring a ground emergency and requesting an immediate evacuation." The response came almost instantly. "Flight 728, ground emergency acknowledged. Emergency equipment is responding." Richard Collins stepped into the cockpit, his face turning pale. "You cannot do that without my authorization." William never looked away from the instrument panel. "I already have the only authorization that matters." Emily Carter reached for the public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and follow all instructions from the flight attendants. We are asking everyone to leave the aircraft as a precaution. Leave all personal belongings behind, and proceed carefully toward the terminal." For a heartbeat, the cabin remained completely still. Then years of crew training took over. Sarah Lopez opened the forward cabin door and guided the first passengers into the jet bridge with an encouraging smile that concealed her growing concern. "Watch your step. Everything is under control. Please keep moving." Parents lifted children into their arms. Elderly travelers accepted helping hands from strangers they had never met. Business travelers placed briefcases on the floor without complaint. The little boy who had asked why the first pilot had been removed looked toward his mother again. "Is this because of the other captain?" She quietly nodded. "I think he was trying to protect us." Outside the aircraft, airport firefighters accelerated toward the gate, while additional operations vehicles surrounded the area. Daniel Brooks remained focused on the thermal scanner pointed toward the left engine. His eyes widened as another reading appeared on the screen. "Captain Harper," he called over the radio. "Surface temperature is still climbing." William answered immediately. "Everyone stays clear of the left side once the cabin is empty." Richard stood frozen beside the cockpit door, watching the orderly stream of passengers crossing the jet bridge. Every confident argument he had made during the past half hour echoed inside his mind, each one sounding weaker than the last. Linda Parker arrived breathless from the operations center. "Richard, the airport emergency coordinator wants a status update." Richard struggled to answer. William spoke instead. "Tell them evacuation is in progress and request a complete safety perimeter around the aircraft." Within minutes, the cabin that had been filled with more than 200 passengers became almost silent. Flight attendants completed one final walkthrough, checking every row, every overhead compartment, and every lavatory before reporting, "Cabin secure." William and Emily exited together, becoming the last crew members to step onto the jet bridge. Marcus Bennett watched from the terminal as they emerged. Before anyone could say a word, a sharp mechanical sound echoed from beneath the left wing, followed by a burst of dense gray smoke rising from the engine area. Gasps spread through the terminal windows as firefighters immediately positioned themselves around the aircraft. Within seconds, specialized suppression equipment was deployed, and emergency crews contained the developing fire before it could spread further. The aircraft remained at the gate, empty of passengers, surrounded by flashing emergency vehicles and disciplined professionals working with remarkable precision. No panic filled the terminal now, only stunned silence. Daniel slowly lowered the thermal scanner, his hands trembling. "He saw it almost 30 minutes ago," he whispered. Emily looked across the terminal until she found Marcus standing exactly where he had been all along. He had never celebrated being right. He had never demanded recognition. He had only wanted people to listen before the warning became visible to everyone else. Richard followed Emily's gaze until his eyes settled on Marcus. The young captain stood alone beneath the afternoon light, his uniform slightly wrinkled from everything that had happened, yet his expression remained unchanged. There was no triumph, no anger, no satisfaction, only quiet relief as the last family stepped safely into the terminal. In that single moment, surrounded by flashing emergency lights and hundreds of shaken but unharmed travelers, the truth became impossible to deny. The man they had removed from command had never lost control of the situation. They had only refused to trust the one person who understood it first. The emergency vehicles remained around the aircraft long after the smoke had disappeared, their flashing lights reflecting across the terminal windows like silent reminders of how close everyone had come to a very different afternoon. Passengers gathered inside the concourse in small groups, speaking softly instead of complaining about delayed schedules. Airport officials established a temporary waiting area, while investigators carefully documented every indication, every maintenance record, and every radio transmission. Within the hour, the preliminary inspection confirmed what Marcus Bennett had recognized before anyone else. A malfunction inside the recently serviced fuel system had created dangerous heat that continued building beneath the engine housing. The aircraft had never left the gate, and because it had not, every passenger stood safely inside the terminal instead of facing an emergency elsewhere. Richard Collins read the first engineering report without saying a single word. The confidence that had carried him through every meeting that afternoon disappeared one sentence at a time. Linda Parker quietly lowered the tablet in her hands. The maintenance team confirmed abnormal fuel temperatures before the external smoke became visible, she whispered. Richard closed his eyes. He warned us before the instruments confirmed it. Daniel Brooks answered gently. He recognized the pattern before the system reached its alert threshold. No one argued. There was nothing left to defend. A short distance away, several passengers approached Marcus. The mother whose young son had watched the entire confrontation stopped in front of him. Her voice trembled slightly. "Captain Bennett, I did not understand what was happening earlier. I do now." The little boy stepped forward holding a folded paper airplane he had made while waiting in the terminal. "My mom said you wanted everyone to be safe." Marcus smiled warmly and accepted the paper airplane with both hands as though it were something priceless. "That is every pilot's job," he replied. "Thank you for trusting us today." The boy looked up at him with complete sincerity. "I want to be a pilot someday." Marcus gently handed the paper airplane back. "Then always remember something. Never ignore a warning just because it is inconvenient." Nearby, Sarah Lopez watched the exchange with tears quietly filling her eyes. Emily Carter joined her and smiled. "He could have spent the last hour trying to prove everyone wrong." Sarah nodded. "Instead, he keeps making people feel safe." Across the terminal, Richard slowly walked toward Marcus, each step seeming heavier than the one before. Conversations faded as employees noticed the airline executive approaching the captain he had publicly removed from command less than an hour earlier. Richard stopped only a few feet away. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Richard removed his company identification badge from around his neck and held it in his hand, not as a gesture of surrender but as a reminder of the authority he had placed above professional judgment. "Captain Bennett," he said quietly, "I believed protecting the company's reputation meant protecting its schedule. I forgot that the reputation of an airline begins with protecting people." Marcus listened without interruption. Richard continued, his voice no longer carrying the certainty that had defined him all afternoon. "I dismissed your experience. I embarrassed you in front of your crew, your passengers, and your colleagues. I was wrong." The terminal remained almost completely silent. Marcus looked through the windows toward the aircraft, surrounded by investigators, before answering. "The passengers are safe. That is what matters most." Richard shook his head slowly. "It matters to me that I failed the captain who was trying to protect them." Marcus offered a calm smile that surprised everyone standing nearby. "Then learn from today. The next time someone brings you uncomfortable evidence, listen before you look for reasons to dismiss it." Richard nodded once. There was no excuse left to offer, no argument left to make. Only the quiet acceptance that genuine leadership required humility as much as authority. As airport employees resumed their work around them, the distance between the two men no longer felt defined by titles, uniforms, or executive offices. It was measured only by one simple decision, the choice to place human lives above pride, and that lesson would remain inside every person who had witnessed the events of that unforgettable afternoon. 1 year later, the morning sky above Atlanta carried the pale gold light that always seemed to arrive just before the first departures of the day. Travelers filled the terminal with the familiar rhythm of rolling suitcases, quiet conversations, and the soft announcements echoing across polished floors. For most people, it was simply another ordinary morning. For Captain Marcus Bennett, it was a reminder that ordinary days were worth protecting. He walked through the employee entrance, wearing the same uniform he had worn on that unforgettable afternoon. But something about the way people greeted him had changed. Ramp agents nodded with genuine respect. Flight attendants smiled before he reached them. Maintenance technicians who had never met him personally stepped aside to shake his hand. None of them celebrated him because he had predicted a mechanical failure. They respected him because he had refused to compromise when lives depended on his judgment. The investigation had lasted several months, involving engineers, safety specialists, and federal aviation authorities. Every maintenance record, cockpit recording, and operational decision had been examined in detail. The final report concluded that the developing fuel system malfunction had been correctly identified by Captain Bennett before visible external signs confirmed the danger. The report also recommended changes to inspection procedures, communication protocols, and executive authority during active flight safety events. Training departments across the airline incorporated the incident into new safety courses, reminding every employee that experience, evidence, and professional judgment deserved careful attention regardless of rank or title. Richard Collins no longer occupied the executive office overlooking the operations center. He had accepted responsibility for his decisions and quietly stepped away from leadership after the investigation concluded. Before leaving, however, he personally approved a company-wide policy requiring executives to defer to cockpit safety assessments whenever credible operational concerns were raised. It was a policy written from humility instead of pride. Linda Parker remained with the airline and became one of its strongest advocates for strengthening communication between flight crews, maintenance teams, and corporate leadership. Daniel Brooks accepted a new position, leading advanced inspection training, often reminding young technicians that the smallest abnormal reading could become the most important one they ever discovered. Emily Carter completed her upgrade training and now proudly wore 4 captain's stripes of her own. Whenever new first officers asked her about difficult decisions, she always answered with the same simple sentence: "The easiest choice is not always the safest one." That morning she met Marcus near the crew briefing room. "Ready for another flight?" she asked with a warm smile. Marcus returned the smile. "Always." As they walked toward their aircraft, they passed a display case recently installed near the terminal entrance. Inside was a framed letter signed by dozens of passengers from Flight 728. Beneath the signatures sat a small paper airplane carefully preserved behind glass. The handwritten message beside it read, "Thank you for choosing courage before convenience." Marcus paused only for a moment before continuing down the hallway. He had never asked for recognition, and he still did not. Beyond the windows, another aircraft waited quietly beneath the bright morning sun, its polished wings reflecting the first light of a new day. Mechanics completed their inspections with deliberate care. Ground crews exchanged hand signals with practiced precision. Every checklist, every conversation, and every careful observation carried a little more meaning than before. Inside the cockpit, Marcus settled into the captain's seat and completed the familiar flow exactly as he always had, never rushing, never assuming, never allowing routine to replace attention. Emily finished the final checklist and looked toward him. "Everything looks good." Marcus nodded gently after verifying each indication himself. "Then we are ready." The engines started smoothly, their steady sound filling the quiet cockpit with reassuring confidence. Outside, the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate as the sunrise painted the runway in warm shades of gold. No applause followed. No speeches were given. No headlines appeared across television screens. There was only the calm rhythm of professionals doing their jobs with honesty, humility, and respect for every life entrusted to them. As the airplane lifted gracefully into the clear American sky, the silence inside the cockpit carried a lesson stronger than any announcement ever could. Real leadership was never measured by the power to give orders. It was measured by the courage to speak the truth before everyone else could see it, and by the wisdom to listen before it was too late.